Americans are sitting on nearly $49 trillion in retirement savings. It's one of the biggest piles of money in human history. And yet, if you look at who's actually poor in this country right now, the group at the very top of the list isn't children. It's people over 65. More than 1 in 7 of them live below what the government calls the supplemental poverty line. So how does a country this rich end up with this many broke retirees? The answer is that the retirement conversation was never really about them. Here's the thing most people miss. The American retirement system was never designed to fully support you. It was designed to top you up. Go back to the middle of the last century. A lot of workers, especially at big companies, had a pension. A promise that your employer would pay you a set amount every month for the rest of your life, no matter how long you lived. You didn't have to manage it. You didn't have to guess. That was called a defined benefit plan because the benefit was defined and guaranteed. Then, starting in the 1980s, that quietly disappeared. Companies swapped pensions for the 401k, a retirement account you fund yourself out of your own paycheck, named after a line in the tax code. Instead of a guaranteed benefit, you got a defined contribution. You put money in. The company maybe matched some of it, and whatever you ended up with at the end was whatever you ended up with. On top of that sits Social Security, the government retirement benefit funded by payroll taxes. But Social Security was built as a floor, not a full paycheck. When it started in the 1930s, it was meant to keep older Americans out of destitution, not to fund a comfortable 30-year retirement. So the modern system quietly asks a lot of you. It assumes you had steady work, spare cash to save, and decades of good luck in the market. Miss any of those, and the system doesn't really have a plan for you. That's who gets forgotten. So what does a forgotten retirement actually look like in dollars? Start with the check almost everyone gets. As of 2026, the average Social Security retirement benefit is about $2,080 a month. That's roughly $25,000 a year. It goes up a little each year with a cost of living adjustment of 2.8% for 2026. But that raise is meant to track inflation, not get ahead of it. Now here's where the two Americas split. The comfortable retiree has that check plus savings. The forgotten one mostly just has the check. How common is that? It depends on how you measure it, and this is where you have to be careful because the numbers get thrown around loosely. In surveys, around 4 in 10 retirees say Social Security is most or all of their income. When researchers match those answers against actual tax records, the share who truly rely on it for 90% or more of their income looks closer to 1 in 5. Either way, that's millions of people living on a check around $25,000 a year or less. And the savings picture is thinner than the headlines suggest. You'll see a number tossed around. The median retirement account for households aged 65 to 74 is about $200,000. That sounds okay? But that figure only counts households that have a retirement account at all. Roughly half of the households in that age range don't have one. No 401k, no IRA. That's an individual retirement account, the do-it-yourself version. So the real median across everybody is far lower than $200,000. Then there's the bottom of the safety net. Supplemental Security Income, or SSI, a separate program for aged people with almost no income or assets. In 2026, the most it pays a single person is $994 a month. Call it $12,000 a year. That's the federal floor under an American who reaches old age with nothing. Put it together, and the cost of a forgotten retirement is simple to state and brutal to live. Somewhere between about $12,000 and $25,000 a year in a country where rent alone can eat most of that. And it's worth pausing on how far that check stretches. $25,000 a year is below what the government considers a living wage for a single adult in most parts of the country. In an expensive city, a one-bedroom apartment can swallow that entire Social Security check before you've bought a single meal or filled one prescription. This isn't a story about people who splurged. For a lot of forgotten retirees, the money was never enough to begin with. Now follow the money, because there's a whole industry built around retirement, and it's worth asking who it actually works for. The financial services business, the advisors, the fund companies, the retirement brands you see on stadium signs mostly makes money one way: a percentage of the assets it manages for you. This is called assets under management. A typical advisor might charge around 1% a year of whatever you've invested with them. Sit with that for a second. 1% of $1 million portfolio is $10,000 a year every year from a single household. 1% of nothing is nothing. So the entire machine has a built-in bias. The customer worth chasing is the one who already has money. If you've got a big balance, you get the advisor, the app, the personalized plan, the birthday card. If you've got a Social Security check and $40 in a savings account, you are not a customer. You're not even in the brochure. You can hear it in the marketing. The industry loves to talk about your number, the giant sum you supposedly need to retire. One widely quoted survey put that magic number at around $1.46 million. Now, most Americans will never see anything close to that, but the number isn't really aimed at them. It's aimed at the people who might plausibly get there, because those are the people whose money the industry gets paid to manage. There's nothing shady about charging for a service. But notice what the incentive does. It pours talent, technology, and attention toward the top, toward the households that need the least help, and quietly away from the ones who need it most. The forgotten retiree isn't forgotten because nobody noticed. They're forgotten because there's no fee in remembering them. And the money that does reach those retirees comes from a completely different place. Not from Wall Street, from the government, from programs funded by taxes run on thin budgets that were never designed to be profitable because nobody's getting rich off a $900 SSI check. So who actually pays to keep a broke retiree afloat? Almost entirely, the public does, through a patchwork of programs that most people don't fully understand until they need them. Social Security is the big one. For a lot of older Americans, it's the difference between poverty and just getting by. Without it, by the government's own math, roughly 47% of seniors would fall below the poverty line. Nearly half. It is by a wide margin the most effective anti-poverty program the country has. Then there's health care, and here's a distinction people mix up constantly. Medicare is the federal health insurance you get at 65, no matter how rich or poor you are. Medicaid is different. Medicaid is the needs-based program for people with very low income and almost no assets. And it's the one that actually pays for long-term care, like a nursing home. Medicare doesn't cover a long nursing home stay. Medicaid does, but only after you've spent down almost everything you own. For the poorest retirees, there's also SSI, that cash floor we mentioned, and SNAP, the food assistance program people still call food stamps. Here's the catch that traps people. To qualify for SSI, a single person generally can't have more than $2,000 in countable assets. 2,000, and that limit hasn't changed in decades. It isn't tied to inflation, so as everything else got more expensive, the bar to qualify for help stayed frozen in the past. Save a little too much and you're cut off. Save nothing and you might get about $700 a month, because most people's other income knocks the payment below the max. There's also a payer nobody sends a bill to: family. When the check runs out and the programs fall short, the gap gets covered by an adult child who drives over every day, a spouse who becomes a full-time nurse, a daughter who cuts her hours or quits her job to provide care. None of that shows up in a government budget. But AARP has put the value of all that unpaid family caregiving in the hundreds of billions of dollars a year. It's one of the biggest hidden subsidies in the whole system, and it comes straight out of the pockets and paychecks of ordinary people. So the safety net exists, it's real, and it catches a lot of people. But it's a net with wide holes and a low ceiling, built to prevent starvation, not to fund a dignified old age. Now, the costs that never make the headline. The first is medical. This is why poverty among seniors looks worse once you measure it honestly. The official poverty rate for people over 65 is just under 10%. But there's a second, more realistic measure that subtracts what people actually spend out of pocket on things like healthcare. And by that measure, senior poverty jumps to around 15%, the highest of any age group in the country. The gap between those two numbers is basically the cost of getting old and sick in America. Medicare helps, but it leaves plenty behind. Premiums, co-pays, dental, hearing, and prescriptions all take a bite. Then there's what you might call the widow's cliff. When one spouse in a couple dies, the household usually keeps only the larger of the two Social Security checks. The smaller one just stops. So the bills don't fall in half, but the income does drop right at the moment someone is most alone and least able to adjust. This is a big reason older women are poorer than older men. And that's the next hidden cost. This doesn't hit everyone equally. Women who often earned less and stepped out of the workforce to raise kids or care for aging parents reach old age with smaller checks and smaller savings. So do many Black and Hispanic retirees who were shut out of wealth building for generations. The forgotten retiree has a face, and it's disproportionately a woman living alone. There's also the cost that shows up as a job. A rising number of Americans in their 70s are still working, not for fun, but because the math doesn't close. When you hear that older workers are staying in the labor force longer, some of that is choice. A lot of it is a bill that came due. So why is it built like this? It's not a conspiracy. It's a series of choices that each made sense on their own and added up to a system with a blind spot. America bet on a voluntary do-it-yourself retirement, savings accounts sweetened with tax breaks. But tax breaks are worth the most to the people who earn the most and can afford to save. So the government's biggest retirement subsidies flow largely to the households that were going to be fine anyway. The people with nothing to save get little from that side of the deal. They get the floor, Social Security and SSI, and not much else. Meanwhile, the demographics are pushing hard in one direction. Right now, roughly 11,000 Americans turn 65 every single day, a wave sometimes called peak 65. More people are living into their 80s and 90s, where savings run thin and medical costs run high. So the number of forgotten retirees isn't set to shrink, it's set to grow. Other rich countries made different bets. Some require workers and employers to pay into retirement accounts automatically, so saving isn't optional. Others lean on a more generous public pension. None of them solved old age perfectly. Every system trades off cost, taxes, and freedom. But the American version leans harder than most on one assumption, that you'll handle it yourself. For tens of millions of people, that assumption simply doesn't hold. So here's the verdict. The American retirement economy is, for the people it's designed for, genuinely impressive. If you had steady income, a good employer, and time in the market, it can carry you comfortably for 30 years. That part works. The problem is who it quietly leaves out. This isn't a system that tried to include everyone and fell short. It's a system built around the saver and the asset holder, and then it acted surprised when the people without assets showed up old and broke. The profit lives at the top, where the fees are. The risk lives at the bottom, where the safety net is thin and frozen in place. The forgotten retirees aren't a glitch. They're the predictable result of a country that treated a secure old age as something you're supposed to earn on your own, and then looked away from everyone the market had no reason to serve. In America, growing old with dignity was never a guarantee. It was a price. And more people are finding out they can't afford it. If this breakdown helped the money make a little more sense, take a second to like the video and subscribe. We'll keep following the dollars behind growing old in America, one system at a time.